Now, we showed you the rate calculation report. Let's go back to our start page. We can show you two other reports that are directly related to this. First one is our contract cost report. The contract costs are coming in from QuickBooks, and then ICAT is allocating the indirect costs amongst the contracts. Now let's take a quick look and see what's happening here. We go back to QuickBooks. We can run a profit and loss by job report for the time period that we're looking at, which I believe we're looking at 2000, or the first 6 months of 2008, so we'll switch our time period up here. And what ICAT is doing is it's going into QuickBooks and finding the amounts of any direct costs charged out to contracts. In this example, the only direct costs we have are direct labor costs. And we can see how the direct labor is distributed amongst each of the contracts. We have 4 contracts. We have revenue for each of the 4 contracts, and here we have direct labor for each of the 4 contracts. ICAT is able to identify these jobs based on our QuickBooks setup, and it is able to then pull the amounts of any direct costs charged out to these jobs. So you can see we have 166,007.37 for direct labor on this first job, and we see the amounts for the various other jobs, and we see the total amount of direct labor amounting to 714,073.76. Come back over to ICAT, we see all that. These are the amounts, there's the total. It agrees back to our QuickBooks cost detail. Now that we've identified the direct costs that are being charged out to the jobs, again, keeping in mind the only direct cost we have in this example is direct labor. So since there are no other direct costs, these other amounts are left blank. Had they been populated, the amounts would carry over here to ICAT. So now that we've established what our direct costs are, we will then look at the allocation of the indirect costs, which in ICAT is happening automatically. We computed a fringe rate of 38.62%. If we go back here and look at our rate calculation report, we come up here and look at our fringe rate, and there it is. It's the pool divided by the allocation base gets us our fringe rate, 38.62%. We then apply that fringe rate to the direct labor on each contract to determine the amount of fringe that's allocated to each contract. This is happening automatically based on our setup. There's nothing that the user needs to do other than click on the report button and set the date range of the report. ICAT does all of the work. So you can see here on this report then, we've got not only our direct costs, which we can do in QuickBooks, but ICAT is also calculating the indirect rates and allocating the direct costs amongst the contracts. So we can see then what our total contract costs amount to on a job-by-job basis. So we're able then to determine the costs charged to contracts in a very concise and very efficient manner. The computation of these indirect rates, the allocations of the indirect costs amongst the cost pools happens very quickly. So basically, once we've got the setup done, it's simply a matter of running the report. And we have a couple of related reports. This being contract costs, we're just able to determine what total contract costs are. But many users would want to see the revenue and the net bottom line associated with this. So if we come back to the start page, we can come and select our contract profit and loss report, which is nothing more than the contract cost report with the revenue line added in and a contract P&L line added in. Contract costs are the same as on the other report. And this then tells us how we're doing for this time period, January through June, how we're doing on each of these contracts. The other report that's related to this that I wanted to identify for you is our indirect rate variance report. Now, you may recall that when we set up our rate model and we went through these various screens, that we established provisional rates in this provisional rate box. Establishing a provisional rate is something companies will do only if they're doing cost reimbursement type contracts. So many government contractors out there will not have to establish provisional rates and will not populate this box. But for those contractors that do have established provisional rates, you have to be cognizant of the relationship between the actual indirect costs that are incurred and the amounts that are billed to the contracts using these provisional rates, which means the user needs to track an indirect rate variance, and ICAT does that for you automatically. You select this indirect rate variance report, you will see your direct costs to each of the contracts. You will see the indirect costs allocated at actual rates. So here are the indirect costs based on all the costs posted in QuickBooks. And we will also show in this report the allocation of indirect costs using the provisional rates, which in effect is an estimate based on our provisional rates, but these are the amounts that are billed to the contracts. So if we have cost plus fixed fee type contracts, and in this example we actually have 3 of them. The very first one is a T&M contract, but these other 3 I believe are established to be CPFF, but let's just go with one. Let's just go with this second job here as a CPFF type contract. We can track the indirect rate variance on that contract. Here are the direct costs in their entirety. We have the allocation of the indirect costs using actual indirect rates, and we have the allocation of indirect costs using our DCAA approved provisional billing rates. So now we can look at the difference, and what ICAT is doing is it's simply comparing the various indirect cost allocations using actual rates to the corresponding indirect cost allocation using the provisional rate. And it's telling you whether you have overbilled or underbilled the contract. If you have overbilled the contract, it's going to display as a negative. And the reason for that is, if you overbilled the contract, you need to send some money back. However, if you've underbilled the contract and there's still funding available, you can submit a claim. And that means the government owes money back to the contractor. So what the contractor needs to do is pay attention to this indirect rate variance, and ICAT is the tool to do it. ICAT will give you that information automatically so the user is able to quickly, easily, and accurately identify the over or under billing of indirect costs on the contracts. Well, that is essentially the setup of the indirect rate model and the various reports associated with it. So we will conclude that part of our ICAT demo. We will, in our subsequent sections, demo the various other aspects of the ICAT product. ICAT provides several different reporting capabilities. It's a very useful tool, but this is the heart and soul, getting the indirect rate model established so that companies can compute indirect rates, allocate indirect costs to the contracts, and track the difference between the actual indirect rates and the provisional rates. We will also show you our various other reporting capabilities in these subsequent demo videos. Thank you for joining us.